Welcome back to Classic Talk with Bing and Dennis. Today we're here with Semyon Bychkov. We were very fascinated with your last words. Let's just continue on where we left off.
So, I mean, after the whole performance, what did you do?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
Of
You
course,
say, well,
I was...
did you tell yourself that I'm ready for the world?
No. It is not the way it goes. The emotion of a performance, and especially, well, let's say, a first performance conducting an opera like that, it's so overwhelming. It is not about the quality of the performance, because one has to realize that someone who is 19 years old conducting it for the first time, it's not going to be the last word on our understanding of the piece.
How many times have you conducted on Onegin since then?
Since then,
Do you have any
lots
idea?
of times. Well, it was 20 times in that 1 year in the conservatory. Then after that I emigrated to America. And years later I returned to it when I became music director of Orchestre de Paris. And there was a production that we played at Châtelet, which was then recorded. The recording on Philips with Dmitry Chvorostovsky, Nucha Focili, and Neil Shikov. Then I returned to the piece later in Florence. I did a production of that. And so, yes, it sort of stayed with me. And of course, that became something very different, I imagine, than it would have been in St. Petersburg.
So would you consider your career is very smooth?
Well, there is not a single career that is smooth, because there is not a single human life.
But the way you put it seems to be, just go one after the other.
Yes, things do go one after the other. But this coming week, I'm conducting Heldenleben of Strauss with the New York Philharmonic. And life of a hero, one can translate it. And it's really quite interesting how the piece begins. The opening bars of the piece take you from the very low note all the way almost 5 octaves higher until it reaches that peak. And so the way it goes up, the melody goes up, and then it falls down a little bit. Then it rises again, higher this time, falls down a bit, until finally it will reach the summit. That is exactly human life. It doesn't have to be a hero. Life is like that. And so, smooth? No, but it's not meant to be.
How did you decide, I want to leave St. Petersburg to go out there?
You have to realize that it was the time before Berlin Wall came down, before Gorbachev was elected, yes, he was elected and started his perestroika. It was still the time of the Iron Curtain. And very early on, long before I have decided to emigrate, I understood that life in that kind of society was not possible for me. It was based essentially on false idea and a lie.
In such a young age, why do you think that way?
Well, I was observing my father's life and what he had experienced, what he had suffered, and why. And one day we went for a walk. I still remember it was in the middle of a very cold winter. Mm-hmm. I must have been 13, 14 years old, something like that, when he explained to me the reality. He said, you see, you're told this is like this. The reality is the opposite. Right. And so from there comes the whole connection. And so this is when I realized that there was a tremendous contradiction between the dogma that was imposed on all of us and the actual reality of life. From there on to the decision to emigrate took a few years, but then it became clear that I had to be free. Right. And that was the real reason why I left. The idea to be free. To be free and to be able to make decisions how to live with music, in music, through music, as a free person.
So when you got out, and did it live up to your expectations? Were you
Yes.
able to do that?
Absolutely.
At the very beginning?
From the very beginning. From the very beginning. You know, I was never under the illusion that the moment I cross the border and find myself in the free world, that free world will be perfect. I never had that illusion. I felt, without knowing, of course, that human nature is the same everywhere. The contradictions will be inevitably. So, but the idea of being free was the most important one, because you're free to make your decisions and you have to accept the responsibility for them, but they're your decisions.
But you didn't know then. You just say, well, I need to leave.
Yes.
You didn't know that the situation will be...
I had no way of knowing. It was an instinct. And I remember arriving in New York on the 6th of August, 1975, in the middle of this typical New York summer, as we know, the heat, the humidity,
right.
and the dirt, at Kennedy Airport, going up the escalator, and saying to myself, it just feels right. It really did.
Totally.
And everything that happened afterwards has confirmed it to me.
And your music making, you noticed immediately a difference?
No, you don't notice that immediately. I was too stubborn not to make music the way I felt it before I left.
Right, right.
So it doesn't make it any better, but it just makes, it just speaks about the conviction. And very often I would be arguing with my teacher, Liam Musin, about a particular place in a piece where he felt that it should be expressed differently, and I would disagree. Years later, arriving to the conclusion that he was right, and he was wise enough to let me go my way, because he was a great teacher.
So New York is your first place?
New York was the first place where I arrived, where I lived for 5 years.
Did you go to school here?
Yes, I did. I enrolled into Mannes College of Music because I knew absolutely no one, and I felt that I have to somehow get connected to the musical world. And I enrolled, and after a couple of months, I would be conducting the student orchestra in a rehearsal. And the president of the school, Risa Stevens, that everyone who loves opera and who followed her career at the Metropolitan Opera, she was president by that time. She heard me conducting that rehearsal, was Dvorak's New World Symphony. And she asked me to come and see her the next day. From the year after, I was the conductor of the Mannes Orchestra, which lasted for the following 4 years. Everything started at Mannes here in New York.
You consider that interaction with her as a major break in your musical life?
It was the beginning, because we played concerts to which she invited various people. So I was observed. I had opportunity to work with the orchestra, to conduct the repertoire. That would be for the first time to me. And everything started thanks to that and thanks to her.
What was your first professional job here in the United States?
Well, the very first engagement that came from nowhere was to conduct the final concert at the Spoleto USA Festival in Charleston, South Carolina.
Really?
Someone canceled. Christopher Keane, who was the music director of the festival, he heard about me. So he engaged me to conduct that concert. I conducted the concert, I returned back to New York, and I think a week later, he called and asked me if I would not conduct Il Trovatore in Art Park, a festival in Buffalo, New York. I never conducted Trovatore. I didn't actually know it. I had 12 days to learn it. I did. as I conducted Il Trovatore, that was Buffalo Philharmonic playing in the pit. They were so impressed, they went to the management, they asked the management to engage me. So from there came Buffalo Philharmonic Association as a principal guest, and then eventually as a music director. While conducting the following summer at Art Park again, someone from the board of directors of Grand Rapids Opera Company in Michigan
Yes.
was visiting and heard me conduct, and she knew that Grand Rapids Symphony were looking for a music director. The season was planned. Well, they created another concert for me to come and conduct, which I did. After the concert, I was asked to become the music director of the Grand Rapids Symphony. So from 1980 until 1985, this is where I lived. And then I moved to Buffalo to become their music director until I went to Paris in '89.
Uh-huh.
But everything started in New York.
New York.
15 years, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, 15 years after you left Russia, you went back to St. Petersburg. Was that correct?
It was actually 12 years
12
later.
years. What was the occasion, and what was that like for you to return?
You see, that was 1987. I left in 75. So 12 years later. By then, perestroika, started by Gorbachev, was changing the situation for people like me. When I left the Soviet Union, I left with the idea that I will never come back. I was stripped of my citizenship. I came to America and was given a status, refugee, conditional entrant.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never thought I would be able to go back. During those 12 years, my father, who wanted to emigrate, was refused. And so there was no discussion that I could. But then it's changed. And in 1987, they allowed my father finally to leave. Mm-hmm. So he came to America to live with me. And then I felt that I could go back and visit. And just before Christmas 1987, I flew to St. Petersburg just to visit my teacher, Ilya Musin. And that was my first visit, which was a private one. I think 1 or 2 years later, I was invited to conduct Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra, belated debut, because the one that was meant to have happened in 1974 was cancelled for political reasons.
Right. It must be difficult for 12 years not seeing your family, your father, right?
It was difficult simply because one cannot predict what the future brings. And the idea was that it's just not going to happen.
What was the first time when you saw your father, and after 12 years, what was the first thing he said to you?
It was in Vienna. He flew to Vienna.
Uh-huh.
I flew to Vienna too.
Sure.
I met him as he came out of the customs. Very slim, with an attaché case, very happy. And I don't remember exactly what we said to each other, because there was so much to say that you could say everything and nothing at the same time.
Sure.
You know, we went for dinner that first night, and we ordered something to eat. And before they brought the food, he stuffed himself with bread.
Oh.
Very Russian thing to do. He had no space afterwards.
Did you tell him, say, Dad, don't do that? Yes, I know. Talking about this, you were trained in Russia, St. Petersburg. Now, when you come to the so-called free world, I mean, everything you learned is a different way, is heavy in different things. How do you change that, or just gradually?
You know, it's very interesting. The question is very interesting. We musicians, actors, any performers, we are interpreters. We interpret a work of art, be it a theater play, be it a symphony, be it an opera, be it a ballet. We are interpreters. How can you interpret a subject that you haven't lived? Writers, when they write something, they will invent, but they will invent something that they have lived somehow, and they will be credible. For us, it's exactly the same thing. One is born in a particular country, in a particular culture, and one will be interpreting the works of art coming from another culture. It's not possible, and it would be unthinkable to confine the Russians to Russian music, Germans to the German music, French to French, and Americans to American. It's unthinkable for us. But to do it credibly, you have to, in a way, assimilate the cultures from which this art is born. So that was one of the reasons why I needed to leave, in order to be able to assimilate the cultures of the music that's dear to me. Russian music wasn't any less important, some of it, as I left. But the other one was always as important, which means Beethoven, Brahms, and Mahler, and Bruckner, and Bach, and Ravel, and Berlioz, what have you, Verdi, Puccini, all of that. How can you do that as a tourist and do it credibly?
After all those years of conducting symphony and opera, are there any styles, genres, or periods that you just have found, no, I leave that for someone else to do?
There is plenty of music that I will not conduct. In some cases, it is because I feel no connection to it. It is not necessarily a value judgment of the music itself or a composer himself. Not at all. For many years, I almost have not conducted Sibelius, recognizing that it's a very great composer. There is music that is very important to me that I don't conduct because I don't have time to get around to doing it. There was certain music of the early period, classical, early music, that I conducted early on and stopped, that had to do with Bach, with Mozart, with Beethoven, because I came to the point where I realized that the way in which I was expressing it early on was no longer valid for me, and I had to figure a way to do it from another point of view, and it took me some years. And so I'll give you an example of B minor Mass of Bach, which I conducted during my years in Buffalo. That's 1980s, early 80s. After that, for the next 20 years, I haven't touched it. And when I came back with another position on it. So there are many different reasons. But inevitably, whatever music I choose to conduct, it is the music that's genuinely important to me. Otherwise, I will not touch it.
Are there any operas or symphonies that you haven't conducted that you have a desire, a craving, that, or you feel, I must do this before I lay down the baton?
There is plenty, and I have come to a realization that a lot of it will remain undone because time is very short to do something with a complete commitment. And in a way, every project, and I call it projects because every project becomes an obsessive one and requires total immersion. And otherwise one cannot do it. But therefore, the quantity will become somewhat reduced for quality to prevail.
That's a good change, a good exchange, I would say.
So what is your, shall we say, continued, what would you like to do? What would you like to be?
Exactly what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah.
We have just finished with the Czech Philharmonic recording Tchaikovsky cycle. All symphonies, 6 symphonies plus Manfred, which is a monumental symphony, 3 piano concertos, Francesca da Rimini, Romeo and Juliet, and Serenade for Strings. The set will come out at the end of August on Decca label. As we have just finished it, we have already started our next cycle, and that will be the Mahler Symphony cycle. Number 2 has been recorded. And so Tchaikovsky cycle took us 4 years to realize. These are studio recordings, apart from piano concertos, which are live. And Mahler cycle will be done in exactly the same way. Well, there are 9 of those symphonies, and they take a certain amount of time.
You also have your Beloved Friend project. Is that still going on, or did that finish?
That is the Tchaikovsky Project.
That is the...
Which we have finished.
You finished, because you took that beyond just recording the Tchaikovsky.
Yes, you see, at the time when I was asked whether I would want to make a commitment to this recording with the Czech Philharmonic, to this project, and I said yes. And then I said to myself, well, his music has always been very much in my life and will become even more so for the next years to come. And therefore, as it is a focus, I must do it elsewhere as well. From there came actually the idea of doing this project in New York with the New York Philharmonic came from New York Philharmonic, and they had no idea of the project of the recordings that I would do with the Czech Philharmonic. It was a complete coincidence, which immediately said to me, yes, that's the right thing to do. And from there I said, well, then I must do it in London as well. And we did that with the BBC. And I called it Beloved Friend. I was looking for a name, because Tchaikovsky Project, yes, but I needed something else that would maybe describe how I feel about him. And I couldn't come up with it. Until one time I was at a dinner with friends, and amongst them was a great British playwright who was talking about Tchaikovsky, that he loved. And he said, a few years ago, he did a special project for Covent Garden, where he assembled various letters of Tchaikovsky that were read, and some music was performed. It was a mixture of that. And he called it Beloved Friend. And at that moment, I knew that was what I was looking for. Actually, the expression comes from Tchaikovsky himself. There are so many letters that he exchanged with Nadezhda von Meck, who was a guardian angel of his life. She made it possible for him to live his life only as a composer. And there was tremendous correspondence between the two people who have never met by his choice, in which letters, in a way, like a confession of the soul from one to the other. And so often they address each other as beloved friend. And from there came the name of this Tchaikovsky Project.
A couple of years ago, you conducted the first piano concerto here in New York, but the original, the Urtext version,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
And you were the first person since Tchaikovsky conducted the New York Philharmonic in that piece, in that version. Is that correct?
It is correct.
What was, well, first of all, is the version greatly different than the version we all know and love? And what
It
was
is
that
the same.
like?
It is the same music, except for a tiny stretch in the last movement, which does not exist in what one normally hears. But the spirit of the concerto is very different in this second version. Imagine that instead of pianist starting his part in the concerto with those chords, D-flat major chords, they are still the chords, but they are arpeggiated in a way like a harp, which brings a completely different spirit to the music. And so suddenly the concerto that one, I mean, there is a reason why this concerto made the world so crazy, why people need to hear it and love it so much. But the spirit of it is very different in the genuinely original version of Tchaikovsky than the one that was then later edited and adapted. And it becomes a very lyrical piece as opposed to monumental, well, I would not want to call it Stalinist version, but I have this image of Tchaikovsky competition where in the final round there would be 8 finalists and each one would have to play Tchaikovsky piano concerto in addition to another concerto of his or her choice. And I always have this in front of my eyes and my ears, how it starts and how it goes. Totally predictable and incredibly physical. But this version is a very different outlook on him and his music, and so much more in tune with who he was.
You know, as a musician and conductor, you always feel that you need to listen and you need to hear. Now, what is the difference between listening and hearing?
You know, it is quite remarkable that you should put it in those terms, because, yes, one must listen all the time in one's life. I'm not just talking about while conducting, that you must listen to what is coming at you as a result. You must listen to what people try to tell you. Yes, it's not enough. You have to hear what they say, and you have to hear what they play. So listening is the first step. Finally, one has to hear what one listens to.
It's very true.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. This has been very, very enlightening, and we're so happy you came to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Classic Talk with Bing and Dennis. Today we've had the great pleasure of speaking with Semyon Bychkov.